June 23rd, 1942. Royal Air Force spotters at Pembrey Airfield in South Wales watched through binoculars as a sleek German fighter descended through the clouds and lined up for landing. Alert sirens should have been screaming. Anti-aircraft guns should have been tracking the enemy aircraft. But something about the pilot's approach seemed wrong. The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down smoothly on the grass runway and rolled to a stop near the control tower. The engine shut down. The canopy slid back, and Oberleutnant Armin Fabers of Jagdflugzeug climbed out of his cockpit, pulled off his leather helmet, and looked around at the unfamiliar buildings. Then his blood ran cold. The aircraft on the flight line weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The uniforms running toward him weren't Luftwaffe gray. They were Royal Air Force blue. And the realization that hit Faber in that moment was the same one simultaneously striking British intelligence officers across southern England. Germany's most lethal fighter. The aircraft that had been slaughtering Allied pilots for months. The mysterious new weapon that seemed invincible in combat had just been delivered intact to Britain by a pilot who had gotten disoriented and thought he was landing in France. The intelligence windfall was staggering. But what American test pilots would discover when they finally got their hands on this aircraft would change how every Allied fighter engaged German aircraft for the rest of the war. For 8 months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been a nightmare haunting Allied pilots across the Channel. It had first appeared in combat over France in September 1941. And from its very first engagement, pilots knew they were facing something extraordinary. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader J.E. Johnson, who would become Britain's top-scoring ace, encountered the FW-190 in early 1942 and barely survived. "It was faster than our Spitfire Mark V's in level flight and in the dive," he wrote. "It could outroll us." Its firepower was devastating. For the first time in the war, our fighters were comprehensively outclassed. The statistics backed up the terror. In the first 6 months of 1942, RAF fighter losses over France climbed dramatically. Experienced pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were being shot down by an aircraft they couldn't match. The FW-190 could dive away from pursuing Spitfires, outroll them in turning combat, and destroy them with cannons that fired 20-millimeter explosive shells. American pilots arriving in Britain with their P-47 Thunderbolts heard the warnings immediately. Don't engage the 190 in turning combat. Don't try to outroll it. Don't get into a dive competition. The list of what not to do was long. The list of what would work was terrifyingly short. Intelligence desperately needed answers. What made this aircraft so effective? What were its limitations? How could Allied fighters counter it? But getting those answers required examining an actual FW-190, and every example shot down over Britain had been too damaged to reveal its secrets. Then Armin Fabers made his catastrophic mistake. Oberleutnant Armin Fabers was not a novice pilot. At 21 years old, he had already scored multiple victories and was considered a skilled member of Jagdflugzeug II, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he was flying as part of a fighter sweep over the English Channel, providing top cover for German bombers attacking coastal targets. The mission had gone smoothly until the return flight. Somewhere over the Channel, during aggressive maneuvering while engaging British fighters, Fabers became disoriented. Cloud cover obscured the coastline, the sun's position gave him false directional cues, and when he broke through the clouds and saw green countryside with an airfield below, his mind made a simple but catastrophic assumption. He thought he was over France looking at a Luftwaffe base. He was actually over Wales looking at RAF Pembrey. The mistake seems impossible in hindsight, but combat disorientation was more common than militaries admitted. Pilots flying at high speeds through clouds, pulling high-G maneuvers that affected blood flow to the brain, sometimes lost their sense of direction. Faber had done a 180-degree turn during the dogfight and simply didn't realize it. When he landed and saw the Spitfires, Faber attempted to restart his engine and take off again, but RAF personnel were already surrounding the aircraft. Within minutes, he was in custody, and British intelligence officers were examining the pristine Focke-Wulf 190A, sitting on their runway. The immediate reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on euphoria. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, immediately ordered the aircraft transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for testing. Every aspect of the machine was to be documented, measured, and analyzed. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough being inspected by Britain's top aviation engineers. What they found explained everything Allied pilots had been experiencing in combat. The aircraft was a masterpiece of practical engineering. While the Spitfire represented elegant aerodynamic design, the FW-190 embodied brutal functionality. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower, compared to the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470. But raw power wasn't the whole story. The FW-190's most devastating advantage was its roll rate. The aircraft could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter. This seemingly minor characteristic was actually revolutionary in combat. When a Spitfire tried to follow an FW-190 through rolling maneuvers, the British fighter couldn't keep up. The German pilot could reverse direction, gain angles, and line up shots before the Allied pilot could react. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown flew the captured FW-190 extensively and immediately understood why Allied pilots were dying. The ailerons were light and responsive at all speeds, he reported. You could throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort. The Spitfire required muscle and finesse. The FW-190 responded to thought. The firepower advantage was equally stunning. The FW-190A-3 carried 420mm MG 151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst delivered more explosive power than a Spitfire Mark V could generate in 10 seconds of firing, and the weapons were mounted close to the fuselage, creating a tight concentration pattern that was devastating at combat ranges. The dive performance explained how FW-19s consistently escaped pursuing Spitfires. The German fighter's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics meant it could outdive anything the RAF flew. Pilots who tried to follow an FW-190 into a steep dive watched helplessly as the German aircraft pulled away. But testing also revealed weaknesses, and this is where the intelligence value became strategic gold for Allied forces. The FW-190's radial engine, while powerful, created cooling problems at high altitudes. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's performance fell off dramatically. The engine struggled in the thin air, and pilots reported loss of power and overheating issues. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's Merlin engine, designed for high-altitude operation, actually performed better as altitude increased. The heavy weight that made the FW-190 a superior dive bomber also made it less maneuverable in sustained turning combat. It could outroll a Spitfire, but not outturn it. Most critically, American engineers discovered that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed significant strength to pull out. This created a vulnerable moment. If an Allied fighter could pursue through the initial dive and catch the FW-190 during the pullout, when the German pilot was fighting his own controls, attacks became feasible. British intelligence immediately began distributing tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons. They also invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured FW-190. In August 1942, U.S. Army Air Force pilots arrived to examine Germany's secret weapon. These pilots would return to American training bases with knowledge that would save hundreds of lives. Major Cass Howe, one of the first Americans to fly the captured FW-190, filed a detailed report distributed to every fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe. His assessment was blunt. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows what he's doing. Our advantage is altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later model Spitfires have the edge. Force them high and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat and we die. This single piece of intelligence fundamentally changed American fighter tactics in Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began operations in 1943, their doctrine emphasized high-altitude combat. Bomber escorts flew at maximum altitude. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet whenever possible. When German fighters attempted to engage, American pilots would climb, forcing the FW-190 into thin air where its engine struggled. The captured FW-190 also influenced American aircraft development. Engineers studied the roll rate advantage and began modifying P-47 and P-51 ailerons to improve responsiveness. The FW-190's gun placement informed American thinking about weapons concentration. Even the cockpit layout, optimized for combat efficiency, influenced future designs. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The FW-190 wasn't invincible. Once pilots understood its strengths and weaknesses, they could fight it and win. By late 1943, the tactical situation had shifted. American P-47s and P-51s were engaging FW-190 at high altitude where Allied fighters held the advantage. The Spitfire Mark IX, with upgraded Merlin engines, could match the FW-190's performance at nearly all altitudes. Kill ratios began shifting in the Allies' favor. German pilots noticed that their enemies had changed tactics. High-scoring ace Joseph Pips Priller wrote that American pilots knew not to follow us into rolling scissors. They force us high where our engines labor. They've learned. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the war, serving as a reference for evaluating new German variants. When the FW-190D-9 Dora appeared in late 1944, Allied engineers immediately compared it to Fabers' aircraft to understand the design improvements. After the war, aviation historians calculated that the intelligence from Fabers' mistake influenced thousands of pilots through tactical manuals, training films, and direct demonstration flights. Captain Eric Brown later wrote, "Fabers' navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every tactical advantage the FW-190 possessed was documented, and every weakness was exploited." That single aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any other intelligence coup of the war. Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Canada. He survived, returning to Germany after the war and living until 1976. The Luftwaffe initially blamed him for the loss, but later acknowledged that combat disorientation could happen to anyone. The story of Fabers' captured fighter teaches a crucial lesson about technological advantage in warfare. The Focke-Wulf 190 represented a leap in fighter design when it appeared in 1941. For nearly a year, it dominated the skies. But that advantage vanished the moment the Allies could study one up close. No aircraft is invincible. Every design involves compromises and trade-offs. Once you understand them, you can defeat them. The FW-190 is remembered as one of World War II's great fighter designs, but its legend is forever tied to one man's mistake. A single moment of disorientation turned Germany's most advanced fighter into an open book and helped the Allies win control of the skies over Europe.